Good afternoon. Welcome back to our afternoon keynote session. In this particular session, we're going to be talking about social justice issues. And certainly social justice is at the epicenter of our society and our corporate experience, and ethics and compliance is part of that conversation. And so we're very pleased to have our presenter, Debo Adegbile, and I'll introduce a little bit more about Debo in just a moment. He'll be joined a little later in the program by Sandra Evers-Manly, who is the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility at Northrup Grumman. And Sandra will be facilitating the Q&A and entering into dialogue with Debo on these important issues. Debo is a partner in the Government and Regulatory Litigation Group at Wilmer Hale. He focuses his practice on a range of matters at the intersection of law, business, and government policy. He has significant experience in commercial, government-facing, and appellate litigation, as well as strategic counseling in high-stakes cases, anti-discrimination matters, and investigations. Debo chairs the firm's anti-discrimination practice. And in addition, he currently serves as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, appointed to that position by President Obama in 2016. And so it's my pleasure, Debo, to welcome you to the ECI. The floor is yours.
Ernie, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me, ECI, and Ernie, thanks for that introduction. It's wonderful to be speaking to all of you today about these issues. In some sense, the issues have come to us in the news since the time that we initially began talking about this presentation. We've seen that corporate America has been engaged on a range of issues that have been sort of ripped from the headlines in terms of companies vocalizing and talking about various social justice issues. So I think we all recognize that this is a very timely panel, and I'm looking forward to speaking to Sandra about the issues and exploring them more deeply. I thought what I might try and do at the outset, based on my experience as a lawyer, as a counselor to companies of all kinds, for-profits, not-for-profits, governmental entities, municipalities, on a range of issues that intersect in the area of social justice. I thought what I might do is to try and set out a frame of three organizing principles that we might use to think about these issues and where they've come in the moment that we're in. The first is to understand and to talk a little bit about what has changed. Something has changed in the way that companies are thinking about these issues, and something has changed in terms of the expectations that some, perhaps many employees have about the extent to which companies engage on these issues. I know that when I came out of law school and I went to my law firm to begin my practice, I was not very focused on taking direction or really expecting that my firm or my company, as it were, would be very much engaged in social issues per se. I think today there's a difference in terms of what employees expect and thus what companies are doing to respond to the moment. And we can talk a little bit about that. The next thing that I want to talk about is what are companies actually doing? How is the difference being manifested? What are some of the examples that we see? Many of the examples are in the areas of consumer products companies and companies that are out there trying to reach out and engage their customer bases. But I think this work really extends beyond that sector, and we can talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I want to bring it a little bit closer to home and for us to consider and kick around the ideas about what are the opportunities, what are the ethics and compliance opportunities, and what are some of the risks. And there are compliance opportunities and risks, which I submit to you are both internal and external, and we can talk a little bit about those. So taking it back to the top about what has changed, I think that we're in a moment now where there are certain structural things that are different than they used to be. One important thing that's different is social media. Social media is out there in a way that causes stories to take on a very broad and wide dissemination very rapidly. And it is a tool that folks are using to animate and in some sense to utilize in the context of activist campaigns to try and lead to change and to try and apply pressure to companies and other entities that are not acting in conformity with some idea of what somebody's values are. And so this social media channels the activism and the way that something can begin as a small story in some part of the world or in some state or at some plant somewhere and become a national or a global story very quickly is one thing that's different. Another thing that I would submit to you is different is the part that I started with, sort of the expectations about what employees and folks coming into the workforce, what their expectations are about what signaling their companies are doing with respect to their values and how those values are being broadcast and shared. That is to say that for a long time, I think that people have been concerned. Certainly they want to work for companies that are ethical, that treat their employees fairly, that have paths to promotion, that welcome all comers and allow people to succeed to the best of their abilities. I think those things have been in place for a long time, and those aspirations and expectations have been commonly shared. But one thing that is a bit different, and there is some survey data that points to this today, is that younger employees, employees that are entering the workforce in the last decade or so, and I expect this to continue, are really expecting that companies take a position or state their values, or in a sense, one way to think about it is walk the talk. For a long time, companies have had views of values, they've stated their principles, they have showcased some of the good works and the efforts that they have in the community and in outreach. But now it seems that there is a greater desire from within, from the employees that make up our companies, not across the board, to be sure. And obviously, many companies have intergenerational mixes, as they should. But I'm just noting for everybody's consideration that younger people entering the workforce tend to have more active ideas about what companies should be doing in terms of vocalizing their values and their commitments, and in a sense, taking a side on some of the issues of the day. And so one way to think about that is that that's not necessarily an external pressure like social media might be. That's a pressure from inside for people that are inside and within your company. Of course, we'll talk a little bit later about how those two things can intersect and how employees can sometimes resort to the use of social media to highlight issues or controversies in companies. But those are two big structural changes that I think have led to some differences. And then there's one other, which is the polarization in the country and in the United States is such that the stakes seem higher, and there's more of a concern that the ordinary processes of government left to their own devices might not be enough to solve some big problems. And so in a sense, it's a little bit concerning that there is such polarization and that the traditional political parties seem to be very far away on a number of issues. In another sense, and this has been interesting in the last 8 or so years, there is sort of a call for companies to step into the fray. Consider, for example, on some things that have big public policy consequences, but also quite serious economic consequences. And so whether it's issues like immigration reform or other big public policy issues like that, certainly in recent weeks, we've been talking about voting and access to democracy. There is some sense that where the political processes break down, there is a look and a desire, or perhaps even a need, some might argue, for other institutional actors, other folks that have a stake in the American project to step up and take a stand and not simply watch the events unfold or to defer to others to work them out. And I think that one interesting thing is that the extent of polarization and in a sense, political dysfunction is almost an invitation to say more, not to say less. And perhaps we can explore a little bit more about how that works out. And so those are three factors, I think, that really have led to a little bit of a difference and more of an impetus for companies to come forward and say something as people are consumed with the stories of the day. Some good news and unfortunately a lot of difficult news. So what are companies doing? I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is that companies are out there making statements, making postings, and in the wake of last summer's events in Minnesota, events that have the country wrapped right now as a jury is deliberating and sequestered in Minnesota. We heard what we have had described as a moment of racial reckoning. And I think that means different things to different people. In some ways, one of the things it means is that many of us are being called to think a little bit about how the claims of history continue to impact structural relationships today and opportunities and even daily life in many respects today. How is it that our history is continuing to shape opportunity, economic opportunity, but also public safety and things that are a good deal more close to people's everyday lives than simply career aspiration, but also things like walking safely in your neighborhood, where your kids are educated, or what access they have to schools. Recently in the pandemic, access to healthcare and healthcare disparities. The context of this so-called reckoning, and I call it so-called because in the first instance, it's only a reckoning if we actually confront the thing that's in front of us. I think right now we're sort of doing a lot to think about it, and we're taking some steps. Whether or not this will be a moment on the other side of which we will say things changed, I think history will judge. But I think at a minimum, it presents us with an opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about the ways in which some of the structures that the nation has allowed to continue to exist for a long period of time are consistent with what is best in America, what is closest to our aspirations of the American dream and the aspiration for everybody to reach the best of their abilities and achieve things. And so what have companies done? Well, in the wake of last summer's events, we had corporate leaders going out there and doing a lot of different things. We had Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase, who at a branch, at one of the JP Morgan Chase branches, knelt with some of the employees there in a nod to Colin Kaepernick. And JP Morgan Chase has made broader commitments to diversity and inclusion, including with its outside counsel and suppliers. Jack Dorsey, the chief executive of Twitter and Square, declared that June 19th, would be a corporate holiday to commemorate the end of slavery. Many of you may know that Juneteenth is a day that for a long time has been significant in Black circles in the United States, because it's the day that the news that Lincoln had freed the slaves actually reached some isolated communities in Texas who had not known well after the actual Emancipation Proclamation. And so Juneteenth is celebrated for that reason. And last year, many companies began to think about it, talk about the place of that day in our history, and in some cases to acknowledge it. The Reddit founder, Alexis Ohanian, resigned from the board to make way for the first Black director at the company. And Bank of America promised to spend over $1 billion in the next 4 years to address economic disparities, racial inequality, and the issues presented by the global pandemic. I could go on and on because many companies did various things in response to the protests that we saw nationally and internationally. And those moves were in many cases significant. Not only were companies vocalizing their values and concern, but they were putting resources and the weight of their considerable influence and or access and financial wealth behind certain initiatives. We should talk about, as a compliance matter, how some of those things play out and what limitations there may be on efforts to try and level the playing field in some respects. But we've also seen that there have been other things that have happened in this space, and things that create some tougher questions, I think, for compliance folks. How are the compliance issues playing out? And one of them is that in the context of efforts that are designed to level the playing field, there is an overlap of certain anti-discrimination laws, right? So whether you're thinking about hiring or whether you're thinking about special efforts to create opportunity or other things for service providers or folks that may do business with your companies, the principle of our anti-discrimination laws is that everybody has to be treated fairly, that there have to be opportunities for people to compete, that everybody needs to be able to compete fairly for jobs and have an opportunity to apply. So one of the compliance and ethics concerns out of the gate is just thinking about how you do both things, how you navigate the space of trying to create greater opportunity for traditionally underserved and potentially disenfranchised to some extent communities. How do you make the space to do more in a way that doesn't back you up into difficulty, legal difficulty and or reputational difficulty? And how do you do it in a way that's consistent with your company's values and practices? The other thing that I'd say that we should be thinking about as compliance and ethics officers is how are the different ways in which we are doing business and conducting our lines of business, how are they affected by some of the structures and the things that we've taken for granted in the past? One of the big markers in this area is algorithms. Now, I know not every company relies on algorithms directly or has algorithms as the central feature of their business model, but I think it's worth saying that algorithms are large data compilations that are based on what is being fed into a system and then is driving and making decisions or pointing in some direction based on data sets. And there's a very interesting question about what data is being fed into algorithms and how those algorithms are being trained. That is to say, if data is being fed into algorithms that have some bias built in or don't account for certain inequalities that may exist in the world, it could be the case that some of these technologies that have tremendous opportunities to improve our businesses and bring efficiencies to our work could actually aggravate or exacerbate inequality that exists. And algorithms are starting to be used in a range of ways. They're starting to be used in ways that identify people on the street and facial recognition. They're starting to be used in ways that contemplate who is eligible for loans. They're being used in ways that deal with people being offered homes or real estate markets. They're being used in ways that may touch healthcare. They really touch almost every aspect, certainly in the context of hiring and the screening of candidates. Many algorithms are beginning to touch almost every aspect of our life and commerce, as well as government interactions. And so thinking about the way in which we are dealing with and who is dealing with how these algorithms are being built and whether there is a compliance structure to ask the question if at any point the overlay of our anti-discrimination laws that I mentioned could become a difficulty in one context are being considered together with these new models that are doing business and shaping how we do business. So there are a range of considerations. What has changed? What are companies doing? Why are we thinking about it differently? What are the pitfalls of values signaling and being very public about these things? And how do our compliance and ethics officers think a little bit more about how you can advance these challenges, some of which are internal and some of which are external, as I've said. And one of the ways in which they come together is when the value signaling happens, when the company is out there releasing a statement or having some statement or expression of solidarity in light of some injustice that's witnessed and in the news. Sometimes what you see is an internal vocalization or backlash that begins to ask the company whether you are walking the talk. That is to say, whether you are acting in conformity with your own business in terms of the equality and fairness principles that you are publicly espousing. That's another area that we've seen that poses some risks. And it's not a reason not to state your values, but it is a reason to be thinking about what are your internal practices of employment, promotion, having channels reported for employees that are acting outside of the bounds? Do you have mechanisms in place that create pathways for people to report things that need to be reported, so that once you are out there and your company is trying to live its values in the public sphere, you don't have something that comes around behind and creates an issue for you where your employees suggest that there's a gap between what you're holding out there in the public and how you're acquitting yourself at home. Why don't I pause there and invite Sandra to sort of probe some of these issues more deeply. Really glad to be here with you today, and the extent to which all of this is unfolding in the press almost every day is sort of interesting, how it's come into such sharp view since the time that we began planning this panel. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Debo. What a great way to start this panel. You've given us so much to think about, and I will just tell you the questions are pouring in. I will just say, and my colleagues, many on the phone who know me, Sandra Evers-Manly, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility with Northrup Grumman. I both have responsibility for ethics and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so many of my colleagues know that I come right from being on the ground. What do we need to do? And so right now, Debo, we are on edge. This country is on edge. Corporate America is on edge. You talked about generations. There are those who believe companies should speak up and say something, and then there are those who don't. Right now, at this moment, we would love to hear from you, your thoughts of what we should be doing as it relates to the verdict when it comes.
Yeah.
And before.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. I mean, these are the moments that really sort of mark a nation, right? Those of us who were around, and probably a fair number of us were, we remember the Simi Valley verdicts, right? And we remember Rodney King and that situation. And one of the things that was so electrifying and captivated the nation at the time of that violence directed at Rodney King in California was, interestingly enough, the thing that has become so ubiquitous today. It was that there was a visual image of what happened, right? And part of the conversation that we're having now, and part of what has animated folks, is that there is a sense in which many more folks have come to understand some of the injustices that have been visited on certain communities too frequently, but that have not been seen by everybody. And with with cell phones and everybody having a camera and a recording device in their pocket, there are things that get captured now that galvanize, right? When we think of the historical moments that have galvanized, whether it be in the area of policing, or we think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, the march and the beating with Sheriff Jim Clark that led to President Johnson going to the floor of a joint session of Congress and announcing that he was sending a voting rights bill that would become the Voting Rights Act to Congress. It was these images that captured and showed everybody what many people had been living and known, but until there was the visual proof, people didn't need to grapple with it broadly. People didn't need to reckon with it broadly. It was disproportionately borne by some. And I think that there's a bit of a through line of the visual evidence. It's one thing to hear about injustice, but when you see injustice with your own eyes, when you see violence that is untethered and not being used in a way that the law authorizes only to maintain safety, as opposed to meting out some extrajudicial type of punishment. When you see that, it attacks everybody in a visceral way, and you get proximate to the unfairness. So I think right now, as we wait for this verdict, there are many companies that part of what they are doing is thinking about what types of communication should they have, because these issues actually affect some people in some very visceral ways. It affects productivity. Many people are thinking about their family members. What are the risks for them and their kids or children? What is it like to walk in the country as an Asian American person right now in the face of the violence that senselessly is being directed in the nature of hate crimes at people walking down the street for no reason other than animus? These things are very palpable. And so I think some of what we need to be doing is to understand that these events do affect people and that not everybody is able to go on and sort of punch the clock in the way that we have expected and be as efficient as they might be, because they take a toll, right? When you're seeing them on the news, when you're having to talk to your kids about it, when you're worried about your partner, your mother, your daughter, your father, these are issues that become very real. And if the justice system doesn't have a pathway, if the justice system doesn't deliver what many people would perceive a necessary corrective for unchecked power or violence directed at some disproportionately, like George Floyd. And over the weekend, and last week, we've heard about others, right? One just miles from where the trial is happening in a very heartbreaking, another use of violence against an unarmed person. When the law doesn't answer these things, it affects us in a very serious way. And so I think part of what companies need to be doing is thinking about what are their wellness plans? What are the things that you can be saying that recognize the extent to which these things affect your employees? It doesn't affect everybody in the same way, but there are going to be some people who are affected. And so at our firm and at some other firms and some of our clients, folks are thinking about a couple of things. Are there ways to have dialogue about the issues, or have something that channels what otherwise might be just rage or a sense of helplessness alternatively into some deeper understanding or discussion? Is there some panel, some expert who can come to talk about the things, to answer the questions that people have? Is there some way that you can share information about wellness and other things, that resources that companies may have for folks that are having a very difficult time? Is there some internal group or affinity group so that colleagues can be in dialogue with each other? One of the things that we're trying to do at Wilmer Hale is we're trying to sponsor a cross-racial dialogue about what our Asian American colleagues are feeling and what some of our Black colleagues are feeling. The two things sort of have slightly different histories and present themselves in slightly different ways, and yet in both cases, people are in part being targeted or feeling the effects because of who they are, because of their inherent characteristics, right? And so maybe there's some ways in which we can speak to each other and make space to hear from each other. Even if the experiences are different, maybe there's a way to have deeper understanding about what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And then, of course, companies are also making contributions or figuring out how they can marshal their resources, their talents, to help support organizations that are doing good works in various areas. And so those are three big pillars. One of the things to think about is you might want to do some of this before it, to the extent you can, before the verdict, or at least have a plan before the verdict. I find it's very difficult to scramble in the moment. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that the younger generation of employees, because they've grown up on social media, they have an impatience with the passage of time. And so if in a corporate sense, you want to vet a message, you want to make sure everybody has eyes on it, you want to measure twice and cut once, and that's sort of how we do it to manage risk. On the other side, because we live in the Twitterverse in some sense, not all of us, but we know that social media is a big phenomenon in the world. It has shortened the time frame that people expect responses to come. So what seems like focused attention for some of us in the old guard seems like it was yesterday's news and we missed it by a light year. And so part of it is planning in advance to think about how you're ready to meet these moments and to be talking about it internally for your HR and your resource professionals about what the communication might look like. Almost doing a little tabletop exercise. It could go different ways. There could be a guilty verdict, a not guilty verdict, a hung jury. Does this affect our business? Will this affect our employees? Are there messages of support that we could send so that people don't feel dejected?
Great. You've given us some really good things to think about, of actions we can take and what others have done. What about flipping the switch about what are some of the common mistakes that companies have made and some of the things that you're hearing? There have been certainly some messages that individuals have put out and different things. What have you seen from your lens?
So here, this is an interesting one in which diversity and inclusion can actually help with the messaging also, right? So sometimes there are folks that are like planning a message, but aren't vetting the message or getting feedback from folks that may be viewing the message through a different prism. And so you want to have the benefit of having people in the room and have people that are helping you frame messages that are seeing things from different perspectives, maybe getting things from different media sources, hearing different parts of stories, so that you have an awareness of what the dialogue is. I know that we're in a pandemic right now, so we all live in an endless loop of videos like we're experiencing right now, and it's a little bit different than the water cooler. But nevertheless, what are the conversations, what are the dialogues out there, so you can anticipate and figure out like what that just right message is. You don't want it to be too hard, you don't want it to be too soft, you want to figure out how to make that message just right. And part of that is having people in the room that can share different perspectives. I would say that the biggest mistake that people make is where they go out with a very aggressive message of support that is untethered to the company's values or business conduct or the expectations or understanding that employees have of the company that they at which they work. And so here it's the gap between what is being projected to the public and what type of company or entity you are. And so part of what I'm suggesting here is there are ways to find things that are important to say, but don't have your first and most important initiative be jumping out there with some statement that seems like you're joining the chorus if you haven't been doing some cultivation inside and thinking about what it means to be signaling your values in some way. And to the extent you're jumping out there and you're sticking a toe in the water, don't come with such grandiosity that it seems not to ring true. The other thing that's very important to all of us, I think, but certainly to these younger employees, is the authenticity piece. And if you get caught out there taking steps or laying out plans that seem not to be consistent with who you are as an entity or culturally a values fit, I think that's one problem that can lead to difficulty. And so, for example, we've seen clients out there that have had employees out there on social media, specifically criticizing statements and talking about how companies are out there saying X in the public forum, but not really doing X in terms of hiring, in terms of promoting women, in terms of hiring Black people or the like. And you just need to be aware of those things. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that you take a position of analysis paralysis, because for many, that's not a good choice either, because you'll get pilloried for that too. I'm just saying that it's good to think carefully about what you're doing and try to make the commitments be about more than a single statement. Have it be part of a plan to think about how you can do better internally and externally over time.
Appreciate that. I'd love to build on two themes you've talked about. You've spent a lot of time talking about us young people, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around social media. What happens when employees put messages out on social media that does not align with the company's position and our values? Do you believe companies should take an action?
So here there are different considerations, right? There are different conduct policies. We know that people have been fired. There famously was a case of a woman who I think was flying to an African country and had an ill-conceived media post that was replete with denigrating stereotypes about the nation and the people that she was going to visit. And she sort of posted this as she took off for the flight. And as the story goes, I think she was fired before the flight landed because it had lit a fire on social media and had been reposted and tweeted. And so the company took a very expeditious action. There are, here's sort of a mix of what your company standards and conduct policies are. And then in some case, there are some legal considerations that you have to look at and consider as well, to see what type of things are being protected. The very difficult thing, and we're seeing this not only in corporations, but also with some of our educational clients, the very difficult thing is that, of course, we have a culture of free expression and expressing your views, but we also have a culture of inclusion and hopefully, when we're at our best, not promoting hate, not having environments that are unwelcoming to people because of who they are. And so companies often find themselves in a situation where because of social media, things that used to be somewhat private conversations are now recorded for time immemorial. And so they can't be ignored in a sense. They're out there. And so the question is, from employees and folks in your midst, what are you going to do about this? If you don't take a stand, they wonder, are you somehow validating this? Are you somehow saying that various disparaging remarks, whether they be racist, homophobic, religious intolerance, they run the gamut, unfortunately, are these things somehow okay and consistent with the name the company brand? And it's very difficult to step into the space of being some form of thought police. And it's not something that anybody welcomes or wants to do. By the same token, when folks are out there with stuff that saying stuff and posting stuff, particularly when they're doing it in ways, either because of their position or title, there's somebody that could be seen to be speaking on behalf of the company, or they're doing it out there. Some people are foolish enough to do these things on professional networks. People sometimes post things that you would not expect them to be posting on LinkedIn, of all places, or networks that purport to be about business connections and the like. Sometimes you have folks saying stuff out there. These can be very tricky questions for internal compliance folks, but we've seen it break in different ways. We have seen companies take action. It's very important to take a look at and understand what the applicable laws are. State laws sometimes speak to these things. And so, for example, in some states, political party and affiliation would be protected under state law, right? So there's a situation in which you could be validating or vindicating a political point of view that comes very close to the line of being a view that is seen as unwelcoming or threatening to a particular group of folks, if that view is being espoused by a politician of one's liking, right? And that gets into very, very tricky spaces. So that's another area where you have to know what the applicable company policies are, but also know what the law is in the jurisdiction that you're moving forward in. The other thing I'd say about this is I do think that notice is a good thing. So to the extent that this is an area that we're seeing more and more, I think compliance and ethics folks can sort of think about what are the best practices in this area? What should we be telling our employees on the front end? Because if you are sharing with, we all have certain things that we can and can't do in the workplace. And if you're providing notice and telling people what the corporate expectation is and getting people to understand the context, then maybe it's a little bit easier when you have a situation that people were put on notice of the ways in which conduct that may seem like it's happening in the private space is not really private at all. You would think that adults know that, but it's shocking how many don't or don't care until it doubles back on them like a boomerang.
Yeah, I think my ethics colleagues would say, welcome to our world, right? So let's talk a little bit about training. Would love to hear your thoughts about the importance of training. You've certainly talked about conversations, understanding the various perspectives. How important is training from your perspective today? And just how deep should we go with training?
So I think training is important and it matters, but it has to be part of an overall plan, meaning it can't just be training. It can't be one and done training. It has to be training that's done in some interval or some cycle. And one of the things that I think is better, in part, when you have, I remember trainings that I had. I used to work in the US Senate. I worked for the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee some years ago. And I had a training that was about workplace harassment. And the actors that were portraying the scenarios, the scenarios seemed so ill-conceived or awkward that the lesson was getting clouded by the way in which, by my lights anyway, I thought the video had such absurdity to it that it was sort of clouding the very important message of what was trying to be imparted. And so I do think that there is something to looking for the best sources, the most credible types of training that resonate in your companies. I actually have found that sometimes situations or like almost like role play exercises where you have to decide and work through difficult decisions that bring together some of the underlying animating concerns are a little bit better at driving, both having a greater understanding about how there can be complex issues and some close calls that are not easy or not obvious, but also make people grapple a bit more with what the animating concern is and the underlying concern. Obviously, this is not possible in every area. And I think the social science and the mind science says that bizarrely, there are some types of training that you would want to and are intended to signal that there's a problem, for example, with implicit bias. But if you just tell people about implicit biases and you don't give concrete interrupters, meaning tangible things that you can do to work around what are very present implicit biases, if you just make people aware of it, it has the bizarre effect of enhancing implicit bias rather than de-escalating it. There's some evidence to that effect that you need to not just tell people implicit bias is a thing, you should think about it. You have to be a little bit more concrete and provide some interventions. Otherwise, it could have the opposite goal that you want to achieve. So, Sandra, I take this to mean that like training is tricky. It's important. It can't be a solution by itself. There also needs to be accountability, as we've already discussed. When there's training, if people step over the line, you got to put people on notice. You got to hold people to account. It's sort of a culture of compliance, as all of you know, because your jobs are to drive a culture of compliance and to make compliance be a thing that's thought about. And a close partnership with HR in many contexts can help advance this, and looking for the trainings and taking feedback, right? Because there's always a time where you try something and you'll hear from folks that really wasn't good. It didn't do it. We need more of X or Y. Don't be wedded to the vendor or the particular training you've done. If you're getting feedback from your employees that something else, some difference would help you understand more or drive the lesson deeper, be open to that. I think that's a very healthy dialogue.
Excellent. Talk to us a little bit about leadership. What do you see the role as leaders today, both from a senior leadership standpoint, a board of directors standpoint, and then that frontline leaders? I like always talking about sort of that tone at the top, that mood in the middle from standpoint of leadership. What do you see the role of leaders today?
Well, I guess there scarcely could be a more important time than right now, right? It's I have a client, a university president client, and I've been giving some advice and counsel to that client through the pandemic, and so many things have been happening. We have been waiting to check in for the call in which he tells me that locusts have descended on the campus, thinking that the next plague is coming, because there have been so many things, one after the next. It's just the worry that it just won't let up. And so I think leadership is about having confidence in that things can be better, but also being humble enough to know that you don't have every answer, right? And so I think that leadership today is a little bit about that authentic piece of recognizing the moment, recognizing the big waves that are hitting everybody, showing a degree of that vulnerability, or at least that checking in with the sense in which there are difficulties that we all face and challenges that we all face, but also having a confidence that together you can get through those things, and that there will be another side, and speaking to some of the concrete steps in the short term that we're going to take to do those things. And part of it is also being open, as I've said, to what is the advice that is coming in from the governed, from the community, right? And a leader can't govern fully by pull. You have to have some view. You have to have something that's orienting you in the direction that you think you should lead. But there is a way to have a view, but not to be so wedded to it that you're not unable to assimilate constructive feedback. When I was one of the leaders of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I said, look, there's a lot to complain about in the world, and there's a lot to complain about in our shop. And my door will always be open to you if you have some complaint or something that's on your mind that you want to come discuss with me. Except the price for sitting down with me to have that discussion is going to be not only that you bring me a diagnosis of the problem, but that you bring me some recommendation about a suggestion about how we might fix it. And it had a very interesting effect on my colleagues. The door was open and people would come in. It didn't deter everybody. But what that causes people to do is to not simply take up the leader's time venting with a vent that isn't constructive. Sometimes people need to vent, but you don't always want them venting in the boss's office, as it were. You have other things to do. Sometimes you have to listen, but you don't want to make a habit of doing that if people are not being constructive in particular. But if you're asking people to be in problem-solving mode, it forces them to think beyond their narrow experience and what is bugging them about the thing, to thinking about what is within the realm of the possible to remedy it. And so it forces people to think more broadly about how we can be better as an institution. And that is one of the things that I think is, I kind of happened on that, but I think it was a good thing to do, because what it signaled a number of things. First, my door is open. If you have something that's meaningful and you want to talk about, I'll talk to you about it. But second, it said, think about what you're saying, what the problem is, do some diagnosis, and try to get in a constructive mode. Don't just be throwing broadsides against us. There's a lot of important work to be done. Think about how we together can solve the problem, and then I will bring the force of my platform to try and make it better. And now we're engaged in it, and we're problem solving together. So I use that as an example of leadership being about being prepared to make the hard decisions and to lead from the front, while at the same time being open to feedback and thinking about how that you don't have a monopoly on all of the best ideas, and that if you're closing off those channels, if you're not creating avenues for people with good ideas to come forward and to be motivated to come forward, then you are closing off one of the resources that is the strongest resources in any company or organization, which is the human capital that you have to help drive things forward. So you need to create channels for that, but you need to put it in channels that are oriented toward the productive and not just the event. One of the things I hate most about social media are the anonymous broadsides. I understand that discontent has its place, but when somebody's untethered to post anonymous broadsides, the dialogue tends to get a little bit more personal and ad hominem. It tends to be less constructive, hard to do the fact check. Those things are not great. If people are willing to stand up and talk about how we can do better, or what's concerning them, or what's really meaningful, what would really be meaningful, what is the small intervention, those are the ways in which I think you can find a voice, a leadership voice that's important, and that people will begin wanting to rally behind you because they think that you're there for them.
Yeah, you touched upon something in our world about anonymous. Every quarter we're just like, why? What can we do different so people will want to speak up and share so we can get to their issues quicker? And so I'm going to touch upon a recent anonymous open line. We call our ethics line open line because we want employees to know we're open to any kinds of questions or comments. And so individuals sometimes feel companies are not willing to talk about racism. I came from a civil rights family where my cousin was shot in the back for advocating for voting rights. But I still find till this day, people do not want to talk about racism at work or feel that that's a role of corporations. Would love to hear your perspective of that so that I'll know how to respond to a colleague tomorrow.
Okay, well, I'll give it a shot, but 400 years in, to live my own advice here. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I'll tell you how I think about it. So the part I like about the reckoning is that there are some eyes that are being opened to things that we have tolerated for too long. that just shouldn't be and are not consistent with the aspiration that most of us have for everybody to be treated equally and to have opportunity to be part of seeking their own way in the United States. And so I think that there are folks that are more open to talking about these things than they used to be. But I think that we have to do it in a way that also is not so much focused on wagging the finger, but pointing to the concrete examples of things that impede people's way forward. So for example, I think Procter & Gamble, as part of their work in the reckoning and the other side, I think they sought a consultant out and they put something together, I think a video reel or something about different types of implicit biases that employees of their Black employees and other employees face. One of the things that was very interesting in our dialogue internally at Wilmer Hale is that there is a sense in which, because we're all at the same company and we all arrive at the same offices, we think that life is the same. We don't have everybody's outside narrative of what they're experiencing or how life is being experienced. But when you sort of step outside yourself and you think about the experiences that people's kids are having, that people are living in their regular lives. I grew up in Manhattan in the 1970s, and very often when I would walk by a white person on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, they would sort of clutch their purse and pull it more closely to them as I walked by. And that was just something that I got used to, and that I came to understand was something that was going to happen. Now, the signal from that is that I may be a thief because I'm a brown person, and I was a little boy. I was a little boy, and so I may be a thief. And so when you see me walking close to you, you don't assume that I'm a little boy. You assume I might be a thief, and so you clutch your purse closely. Now, I didn't think a lot about that, every day. It didn't shape or limit the possibilities in my life in meaningful ways. But that was a signal that I received as a young person about what it meant to be a brown person in a predominantly white neighborhood as a young man. And that was just one small thing. If you go through life and you think about what your colleagues are experiencing every day, just getting from their home to getting to the office, and you think about the ways in which color and race are affecting the little things, the small things, the waiting in line at Starbucks, the getting on the train, the driving, getting pulled over for a speeding ticket, that there's some people that need to have different rules or think about different ways if they're driving, or how they're interacting with law enforcement than others of us do. All of these things are accumulated piece by piece, little by little. And there now is some health data that is suggesting that the collective cost of racism is one of the things that is affecting Black health outcomes. And this is a growing area of research, but that the accumulated, these little cuts, these little emotional, psychological paper cuts accumulated over time is having some impact on health outcomes. It's beginning to be a broader field of study in public health. And so I think that it would be unfortunate if we're talking about being in a time of reckoning and companies were not recognizing that, like everybody else in the nation, we're all made up of people in a nation that has this history. And the history doesn't stop when we walk in the elevator or walk in, or sit at our desk. It's all happening. I don't mean to say that you view everything through the lens of race and that everything is a struggle of oppression. I do mean that their structures and their decisions through some direct bias and sometimes implicit biases that can affect people's paths to promotion, people's compensation, whether or not people get hired. It's shocking to me when you see the book and the studies that Deva Prager did, a very able young researcher who unfortunately died far too young, where she showed that resumes, if you sent a CV of a person with an African-American name the identical CV of somebody with a white Anglo-sounding name with a criminal conviction, that the person with the white person with the criminal conviction is more likely to get, I can't remember if it was an interview or hired, than the black person without, right? And so here my point is not to suggest that people with criminal convictions are unemployable, because that's a whole separate issue. But that particular study was just showing that even when you put your finger on the scale of things that you might think might make somebody less attractive as a candidate, that blackness was the thing that was really determinative, and that was closing off opportunity in a way that was unmistakable in the research. So that we wouldn't confront these things in some way, I think isn't right. And it doesn't mean you can solve everything in a day, but I think the willingness to attack the things forthrightly and to think about what we can do differently is the start.
What do you say to those individuals who say our role as corporate America is to get the product out the door and to do our business and keep our heads down? How do we talk to those colleagues, those leaders that truly believe that what goes on outside the gates of our corporations, that we really should not be a part of those dialogues?
Well, I'd say that as a general matter, that's inconsistent with the view of how corporate America has acquitted itself over many, many decades. Meaning corporate America has been involved in dialogues, has been involved in lobbying, has given campaigns. Like if you go back and you look at an organization called ALEC, for example. ALEC was an organization that designed and drafted much of the voter ID and photo ID legislation. And they would draft the legislation, then they would give it to a legislator to sponsor in a state legislature. And then if there was certain partisan control in that legislature, the bill would pass. And then you would have a new democracy measure. So go back and dig into, who was funding ALEC? Where was the money coming from for ALEC? It's not always done directly. You may not always be doing it in the company's names, but companies have been engaged in public policy debates in the United States for a long period of time in the area of environmental laws and environmental justice issues, tax policy, immigration policy. I just would say that I would sort of, in the first instance, ask whether that description of the way in which companies acquit itself are actually true and consistent with the ways that companies walk in the world. That's the first question. But the next point, even if you are willing to entertain that there is a version of corporate life that is unconnected or untethered to the public policy debates of the day, even if you are to give that its due, and I think we should for purposes of this question, I guess there's a question about whether or not there is a risk of a reputational disadvantage or harm that comes from taking the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil approach in the current moment. All of life and all of corporate decision-making is a risk calculus. It's a risk-reward calculus. And so I think choosing to speak on these issues is literally a risk-reward calculus, meaning I don't think that any of us think that companies that are speaking out now are doing it entirely because they've made the decision that the moral imperative is the thing that's driving them more than anything else or exclusively. The moral imperative has always been there. I think that part of what companies are doing is calibrating how you are competitive in a marketplace where you have a consumer base, you have social media, you have efforts to have organized boycotts or negative press that may affect the brand. I think it's all a calibration. I'm not saying that it's without principle. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that there's a complex mix of factors that are leading people to do things in this way. And those things are calibrations. And there may be companies that step back and don't do it. We've already seen in the Georgia situation that there have been companies that were sort of in one place and then in another place, and then were pushed to move. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to be the target of a social media campaign or certainly a boycott. That's not something anybody wants. But I think all of this is a risk-reward calculus. And I think we're continuing to see what happens and how it plays out. And for the person who says that we should be the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, there may be a sense in which some companies pay a price for the things that they're speaking, and then the calculus shifts. And part of what we have to see is, where does this play out? I thought that it was very interesting that Mitch McConnell, when the companies began to speak out about voting, came out with a very aggressive statement and told companies not to speak, and then did something that Mitch McConnell never does. He came back the next day, I think, and said that he misspoke and that he didn't say that very well. And he actually kind of walked back the aggressive statement of telling companies to be seen and not heard. That, in a sense, is a signal to the power of companies and an understanding that companies have a voice. They have a voice that is being used, has been used for a long time, and that you can't tell companies not to have or use their voice because it's inconsistent with the way our nation works.
That is so great. So, Debo, we've got about 2 minutes, and what I'd like to just ask you, you're talking to chief ethics officers, ethics advisors. Many of us would say this is the role of the diversity, ethics, inclusion officers or offices. This is a role of HR. Why should we be concerned as ethics officers? And then if you would just give us your closing thoughts. I always ask individuals, again, I am truly on edge. I wake up right now in tears, just scared to death of what might happen in our nation. But would love to hear from you of what you see as the hope for the future. What would you like to see from us as ethics officers? And then just what are you hopeful for overall for our world? Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me, and thanks for those important closing questions. So on the first part about ethics officers, compliance and creating pathways for opportunity for everybody at a company, avoiding risk of discrimination lawsuits from either direction, either that you're closing off opportunity to racial minorities or women or people in other protected classes. That's an issue. Thinking about a lien that goes so far in the other direction that you're closing off opportunities or proceeding with quotas or something that under our laws, our federal and some of our state laws, may be proscribed is another consideration. So I actually think that this is a moment in which ethics officers and compliance officers have more of a role, not less of a role, because the pot has been so stirred that it's a time of innovation, and there needs to be a cross-departmental dialogue. The tone is coming from the top. Many leaders are saying, we need you to do X, we're going to do Y. They're making commitments. And part of your role is to figure out, well, how can we come as close as we can to doing to executing the charge in a way that's consistent with our other obligations and a way that doesn't expose the company to unnecessary risk. Again, I said everything is a risk calculus. Companies take on risk all the time. So I'm not suggesting people are going to choose to be in a position of zero risk. Some risks are worth taking, but thinking about and having a dialogue about the nature of the risks and what the considerations are, and putting that in front of your colleagues and having a healthy dialogue with HR and with people in the executive suite. I think there's a real role for compliance and ethics officers, both to educate themselves about how to do these things and to think about doing them in ways that are consistent with your goals and don't put you in a position that you could be a target or an easy target for some type of challenge. I think that's the moment. And then with respect to the country and the broader issues, I am sold, even in the darkest days, even in the times that we've seen recently that break the heart over individuals and in a sense over the nation. I am sold on the idea that creating opportunities for everybody to pursue the best of their abilities, to have pathways to opportunity, to allow folks to be educated and to go on and pursue their goals next to each other, to not have our K through 12 system, which still is very separate racially and racially isolated, no longer by rule of law, but on account of our history, so that the first time that some folks are coming into connection and relationship with folks across races and from different parts of the country is at college, because they haven't in lots of their K to 12 schools. Being committed to the American project, that the zip code in which you're born doesn't need to frame the possibilities of what you can achieve. This is such a deeply held belief for me, and I believe so strongly in its power, as do Americans from across the country, and indeed people from across the world come here and seek to come here for that reason. I'm the son of a domestic worker from Dublin, Ireland, who came on a boat to work for a wealthy family in Long Island, and a Nigerian student who came to New York, both the eldest of 6 kids that were seeking a dream. And I'm the result of that union, born and bred in New York. And my mom had a 6th grade education, and I've been fortunate to come to the country and learn some things about the law and about race in America and about the American promise and possibility, and try very often to be the voice for the voiceless, but also not just to be the voice for the voiceless, not just to argue cases about the Voting Rights Act or the Fair Housing Act, but also to help my brothers and sisters in corporate America think about how we can do better, because corporations, if they are anything, are engines of economic opportunity. And part of the American dream and American promise is thinking about how that pathway is open for everybody so that the plate can grow and we can have more for everybody. And I understand that resources are not limited and boundless, but I think that you can be part of the answer. And I'm grateful that there are ethics and compliance officers and professionals that are standing guard, trying to help us think about how we do this in the right way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Debo. We could continue this conversation for the next 3 hours, but I want to say you've given us so much to think about, so much wisdom, so many things we can take and put into place into our organizations. I want to say that we just got breaking news that a verdict has been reached. And I just want to say to you, our ethics colleagues, as I sit here about to cry and in chills, we are the keepers of the culture. We have been entrusted with these ethics and compliance roles. I ask us to take a step back and think about the change we want to see in our organizations, in our roles, and in our world. I want to thank the ECI for this incredible time. Thank you so much. Please join us in the breakout room, and let's continue to do great work. Let's continue to be the voice. And most of all, let's continue to make a difference. Thank you so much, Debo, for all that you do. We appreciate you so very much. Thanks so much, colleagues. We'll talk soon. Enjoy the rest of the conference.